Welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into another medical history that's darker, messier, and more dramatic than anything you learned in school. We're talking about insulin. And no, this isn't about pancreases and glucose metabolism. This is about failed experiments on dying children, scientific rivalries so bitter they nearly came to blows, bathroom chemistry that saved millions, and a miracle drug that was supposed to belong to the world but somehow still kills people a century later because they can't afford it. Before we get started, if you're into these deep dives where history gets uncomfortable and real, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe if you want more content that pulls back the curtain on medical miracles. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now settle in. Dim those lights. Get that ambient noise going. Because for the next couple of hours, we're traveling back to a time when children were deliberately starved to keep them alive. When scientists fought over credit so viciously, they had to secretly redistribute Nobel Prize money. When dogs became heroes. And when a discovery made for $1 somehow became a symbol of everything wrong with pharmaceutical pricing. This is the real story of insulin, the one with all the uncomfortable parts left in. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Boy Whose Miracle Failed. January 11th, 1922. Toronto General Hospital. A cold Canadian winter morning. In a hospital bed lies a 4-year-old boy named Leonard Thompson. He's dying, slowly, inevitably, painfully, dying from type 1 diabetes. He weighs 65 pounds. He should weigh closer to 100. His body is consuming itself, burning through muscle and fat because it can't process sugar properly. His breath smells sweet and sickly, like rotting fruit, a telltale sign of ketoacidosis. His organs are slowly shutting down. His parents know he has weeks left, maybe days. They've watched him waste away despite every treatment available. And there are no treatments that work. Not really. But there's something experimental, something untested. A team of researchers at the University of Toronto has been working with pancreatic extracts from animals. They've had some success in dogs. Some, not much, but some. They're calling it insulin, from the Latin insula, meaning island, after the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, where the substance seems to originate. Leonard Thompson's parents are desperate enough to let their dying son become a human experiment. So on that January morning, a doctor prepares a syringe filled with a murky brown liquid. This is pancreatic extract, ground up animal pancreas, mixed with various chemicals, filtered through cloth, something that looks more like swamp water than medicine. The needle goes into Leonard's buttock, the thick liquid is injected, and then everyone waits. Hours pass. They test Leonard's blood sugar. It drops. Not dramatically, but it drops. From dangerously high to slightly less dangerously high. Hope flickers. But then they notice something else. Leonard's still producing ketones. The sweet smell of his breath hasn't changed. He's not getting better. Not really. And then the injection sites start swelling. Painful abscesses form where the needle entered. Red, hot, infected lumps that make him cry out when touched. Leonard Thompson, the first human being ever injected with insulin, is not having a miraculous recovery. He's having complications from toxic sludge injected into his muscles. The Toronto team examines him, runs more tests, discusses in hushed tones, and then they write in their notes something brutally honest, something that would get buried in later retellings of this story. No clinical benefit was evidenced. The first insulin injection in human history failed. Leonard Thompson was supposed to be the miracle, the proof that diabetes could be treated. the beginning of a new era in medicine. Instead, he's a sick boy with infected injection sites, still dying, still producing ketones, still wasting away. The team is devastated. Years of work, all the animal experiments, all the theories, and when it matters most, when they finally have a chance to save a human life, it doesn't work. But here's where the story takes a turn. One member of the team, a biochemist named James Collip, refuses to give up. He knows the extract is impure. He knows it's contaminated with proteins that cause inflammation and toxicity. He knows the active ingredient is in there somewhere, buried in all that toxic sludge. He just needs to purify it better. For the next 12 days, while Leonard Thompson languishes in his hospital bed, while his parents pray and cry, while the rest of the team debates whether to try again, Collip works obsessively in his laboratory. He's trying different techniques, different alcohol concentrations, different precipitation methods, trying to separate the miracle from the poison. And on January 23rd, 12 days after the first failed injection, Collip succeeds. He has a new extract, clearer, purer, less toxic. They prepare another injection for Leonard Thompson. This time, the response is different, dramatically, impossibly different. Leonard's blood sugar drops significantly. His ketone production stops. The sweet smell fades from his breath. Within days, he's sitting up, eating, talking. Color returns to his face. Strength returns to his body. The dying boy is coming back to life. This is the miracle that makes headlines. This is the story that gets told and retold. The discovery of insulin, the first successful treatment of diabetes. But it wasn't the first injection. It was the second. The heroic narrative skips over January 11th. It jumps straight to January 23rd, because the first attempt, the one that failed, doesn't fit the story of triumphant medical progress. But Leonard Thompson lived through both injections. He survived the failure and the success. And in his survival, in those 12 days between poison and cure, lies the real story of insulin. Scientific breakthroughs don't happen cleanly. They happen through trial and error, through failure and persistence, through desperate parents willing to let their dying children be experiments. Leonard Thompson lived. He survived that first failed injection, recovered from the abscesses, lived to receive the purified version. He went on to live 13 more years with insulin therapy, dying eventually from pneumonia, not diabetes. But he carried the scars, physical scars from those first injections, and the knowledge that he'd been the test case for something that almost didn't work. The first human insulin injection wasn't a miracle. It was a failure that led to a miracle. And sometimes, that's how medicine actually progresses, one painful step at a time. Chapter 2. Bathroom Chemistry. So Leonard Thompson survives, but only because of James Collip. And Collip's story deserves its own chapter because what he accomplished in those 12 days was, by his own later admission, barely controlled chaos. Collip was a biochemist, young, brilliant, technically skilled, but working with equipment that would make a modern pharmaceutical researcher weep. He didn't have a sophisticated laboratory. He didn't have precision instruments or standardized reagents. He had glassware, alcohol, some basic chemistry equipment, and a desperate need to make something work. He later described his purification process as bathroom chemistry. And he wasn't being modest. He meant it literally. The conditions were crude. The techniques were improvised. He was essentially doing high-stakes chemical experimentation with the kind of setup a dedicated hobbyist might have in their basement. Here's the problem he was trying to solve. The pancreatic extracts contained insulin, yes, but they also contained dozens of other proteins, enzymes, cellular debris, blood, all sorts of contaminating material that caused inflammation, immune reactions, and toxicity. He needed to separate the insulin from everything else. But how? Insulin is a protein. So are most of the contaminants. They're similar in size, similar in chemical properties. Separating them is like trying to sort sand by individual grain size using only your fingers. But Collip had an insight. Different proteins precipitate out of solution at different alcohol concentrations. If you take a solution containing multiple proteins and slowly add alcohol at certain concentrations, some proteins will suddenly solidify and fall out of solution, while others remain dissolved. The trick is finding exactly the right alcohol concentration where insulin stays dissolved, but the toxic proteins precipitate out. Too little alcohol, and everything stays in solution. Nothing separates. Too much alcohol, and everything precipitates, including the insulin you're trying to save. There's a narrow window, a sweet spot, and finding it requires trial and error. Lots and lots of trial and error. Collip spent days, probably weeks, testing different concentrations, mixing pancreatic extract with various amounts of alcohol, watching what precipitated, filtering, testing, repeating. He worked in a small laboratory space. Glass beakers everywhere, test tubes, flasks, alcohol burners for heating, crude filtration setups using cloth and paper. The place would have smelled of alcohol, of organic decay from the pancreatic tissue, of chemicals. It would have been cold, because this is Toronto in winter, and heating was inconsistent. And Collip was racing against time. Leonard Thompson was dying. Other diabetic patients were dying. Every day he didn't succeed, people died. The pressure was enormous. And then, somehow, through systematic experimentation and probably a fair amount of luck, he found it. The exact alcohol concentration that stripped away toxic proteins while leaving insulin in solution. He filtered out the precipitated junk. He was left with a clearer solution, still not perfectly pure by modern standards, but pure enough that when injected into Leonard Thompson on January 23rd, it worked without causing severe reactions. This was the breakthrough. Not the discovery that pancreatic extract contained something useful that was already known, but the discovery of how to make it safe, how to make it usable. Collip's bathroom chemistry turned a toxic brown sludge into medicine. And here's the thing that should bother you. This critical step, this absolutely essential breakthrough, without which insulin would have remained a laboratory curiosity, was accomplished with primitive equipment in crude conditions through trial and error. There was no grand theory guiding him, no sophisticated understanding of protein chemistry, just observation, experimentation, and persistence. It was messy. It was uncertain. It was, by Collip's own description, basically bathroom-level chemistry, and it saved millions of lives. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Collip's contribution, as critical as it was, got overshadowed. The public narrative focused on Frederick Banting, the surgeon who had the initial idea, and Charles Best, the medical student who assisted him in the early animal experiments. Collip was the biochemist who made it actually work in humans, but he wasn't the face of insulin. He wasn't the hero of the story. He was the technical guy, the one who did the boring chemistry, the one who worked in the background making the miracle possible. And when the Nobel Prize came around, when the glory was distributed, Collip wasn't included in the initial award. We'll get to that injustice in the next chapter. But for now, remember this. The insulin that saved Leonard Thompson, that went on to save millions, that transformed type 1 diabetes from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition, that insulin was purified using bathroom chemistry by a biochemist working in crude conditions with improvised equipment. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs don't require fancy labs or expensive equipment. Sometimes they just require someone desperate enough, skilled enough, and stubborn enough to keep trying until they find the answer, even if they have to do it in conditions that would make a modern safety inspector shut down the entire operation. Chapter 3. The Nobel Prize That Sparked a Fight. October 1923. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine is announced. The prize goes to Frederick Banting and J.J.R. MacLeod for the discovery of insulin. Seems straightforward, right? 2 scientists, 1 discovery, 1 prize. Except Frederick Banting, one of the winners, is absolutely furious. Not happy, not grateful, not honored, furious. Because the prize went to him and MacLeod, and Banting hates MacLeod. Let me give you the context. Frederick Banting was a surgeon. He had an idea about isolating pancreatic secretions by tying off ducts. It was a decent idea, not entirely original, but decent. He approached J.J.R. MacLeod, the head of the physiology department at the University of Toronto, a respected researcher in carbohydrate metabolism. Banting needed lab space, equipment, experimental animals. MacLeod, somewhat reluctantly, gave him summer access to the lab. He assigned Charles Best, a medical student, to assist. And then MacLeod left for vacation in Scotland, leaving Banting and Best to conduct their experiments. During that summer, Banting and Best worked on dogs, removing pancreases, injecting extracts, monitoring blood sugar. The work was promising but crude. When MacLeod returned, he looked at their results and immediately saw both the potential and the problems. The extracts were impure. The experiments lacked scientific rigor. But the core finding, that pancreatic extract could lower blood sugar, that was real. MacLeod brought in James Collip to handle the purification chemistry. He provided more resources. He guided the experimental design. He used his professional reputation to help get the work published and recognized. From a scientific management perspective, MacLeod did exactly what a department head should do. He recognized promising work, provided support, brought in expertise, and helped shepherd the discovery toward clinical application. But Banting saw it differently. From Banting's perspective, MacLeod had dismissed his idea initially, had grudgingly given him lab access, had gone on vacation while Banting did the actual work, and then had swooped in to take credit once the results looked promising. Their relationship was toxic. They argued, they disagreed on experimental design, they fought over credit, over authorship, over who contributed what. And when the Nobel Prize was announced, giving the award to Banting and MacLeod, but not to Best or Collip, Banting exploded. His research partner, Charles Best, the medical student who'd worked beside him through that crucial summer, who'd helped conduct the experiments, who'd been there from the beginning, was ignored. Meanwhile, MacLeod, whom Banting viewed as a bureaucratic parasite, was being honored as a co-discoverer. Banting's reaction was not dignified. According to multiple accounts, he got drunk, publicly drunk, and he ranted about the injustice, about MacLeod stealing credit, about Best being robbed. Some reports suggest he said he wanted to refuse the prize entirely. Others say he wanted to punch MacLeod. He definitely said he would share his prize money with Best. And he did. Quietly, he gave half of his Nobel Prize money to Charles Best, a secret financial reallocation that acknowledged what the Nobel Committee hadn't, that Best deserved recognition. But the story doesn't end there. J.R. MacLeod, for his part, also gave half of his prize money away to James Collip, the biochemist whose purification work had made insulin clinically viable. So you have this bizarre situation where the two official Nobel laureates both immediately give away half their prize money to the people they think actually deserved recognition. Which raises an obvious question. If Banting and MacLeod both thought other people deserved credit, why did the Nobel Committee get it so wrong? The truth is, insulin's discovery wasn't clean. It wasn't a moment of individual genius. It was a collaborative effort involving multiple people with different skills. Banting had the initial experimental idea. Best did much of the hands-on animal work. MacLeod provided expertise, resources, and scientific credibility. Collip solved the purification problem that made human use possible. Take away any one of them, and insulin doesn't happen, at least not in Toronto, in 1921 to 1922. But the Nobel Prize, by tradition, goes to, at most, 3 people, and the committee decided on 2. Their reasoning seems to have been that Banting was the originator, and MacLeod was the senior scientist who made it all possible. But that decision satisfied no one. It excluded crucial contributors. It honored a relationship so toxic that the 2 winners couldn't stand to be in the same room together. The 1923 Nobel Prize for Insulin is often cited as one of the most controversial in the award's history. Not because the discovery didn't deserve recognition, it absolutely did, but because the distribution of credit was so messy, so contested, so obviously incomplete. And here's what really stings. The informal redistribution of prize money by Banting and MacLeod acknowledged the real contributions. But it didn't change the historical record. Best and Collip don't appear on the Nobel Prize. Their names aren't in the official list of laureates. They got money, but they didn't get recognition. Not the recognition that lasts, anyway. Years later, Best would spend much of his career fighting for acknowledgement, writing about his role, emphasizing his contributions, trying to correct a historical narrative that had marginalized him. Collip, more quietly, moved on to other work. His contributions are recognized by historians and scientists who study insulin's development. But the public memory, the simple story, leaves him out. And Banting and MacLeod? Their relationship never recovered. They remained bitter. The prize that should have been a celebration became a reminder of conflict. Banting died in a plane crash in 1941. MacLeod died in 1935. The Nobel Prize for Insulin exposed a truth about scientific discovery that the clean textbook narratives hide. Credit is messy. Collaboration is complicated. And sometimes the official recognition misses the people who actually made it work. The prize money got redistributed, informally, secretly, between colleagues who knew the real story. But history? History is harder to redistribute. And that's why, a century later, most people know Banting's name, but not Collip's. Even though Collip's bathroom chemistry was just as crucial as anything Banting did, the Nobel Prize for Insulin was a recognition that left people angry, bitter, and fighting over credit for decades afterward. Not exactly the triumphant moment medical history likes to pretend it was. Chapter 4. The Scientist They Erased. Before we continue with Toronto's story, we need to talk about someone who technically got there first, someone whose name was deliberately buried, someone whose scientific contributions were real, but whose personal beliefs were so toxic that history chose to forget him. His name was Nicolae Popescu, and in 1921, before Banting and Best achieved their famous results, he was in Bucharest, Romania, injecting diabetic dogs with pancreatic extract. And it worked. Popescu was a physiologist. He'd been studying the pancreas and diabetes for years. He understood that the pancreas produced something that regulated blood sugar. He called it pancrein, from the pancreas. In 1921, he published papers in French medical journals documenting his experiments. Diabetic dogs injected with his pancreatic extract showed clear reductions in blood sugar and glycosuria, sugar in the urine. His work was methodical, well documented, published in respected journals. By the strict definition of scientific priority, Paulescu got there first. His published work predates the Toronto team's clinical success. So why don't we celebrate Nicolae Paulescu as the discoverer of insulin? Why isn't his name in textbooks? Why did history choose Banting and Best over him? Part of the answer is technical. Paulescu demonstrated that pancreatic extract could lower blood sugar in dogs, but he never successfully purified the extract for safe human use. He never made the leap from animal experiments to clinical treatment. The Toronto team, thanks to Collop's purification work, produced insulin that was safe enough for repeated human injections. They turned a laboratory observation into a practical therapy. That distinction matters. Showing something works in dogs is important. Making it work in humans is transformative. But there's another reason Paulescu's name disappeared. A darker reason that has nothing to do with science. Nicolae Paulescu was a virulent anti-Semite, not just casually prejudiced in the way many people of his era were, actively, vocally, violently anti-Semitic. He wrote political pamphlets promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. He advocated for discriminatory policies against Jewish people. He was involved in far-right political movements in Romania. His views were extreme, even by the standards of early 20th century Europe. And after World War II, after the Holocaust, celebrating someone with Paulescu's beliefs became impossible. So history made a choice, a deliberate choice. Romania tried to promote Paulescu's claim to insulin discovery in the decades after his death. They issued stamps. They erected monuments. They pushed for international recognition. But the international medical community resisted. Yes, Paulescu had done legitimate scientific work. Yes, he'd published findings about pancreatic extract before the Toronto team achieved clinical success. But he'd also been a hateful bigot whose political views represented everything the post-war world wanted to leave behind. The Nobel Committee never seriously considered giving him the prize, even posthumously. The international diabetes community never acknowledged him as insulin's discoverer. His scientific contributions were real, but his personal toxicity made him unacceptable as a symbol, and so Nicolae Paulescu was written out of the story. His name appears in detailed histories of insulin. Diabetes researchers know about him, but the public narrative, the simple story told in schools and museums, skips over him entirely. It jumps from Frederick Banting's idea to clinical success in Toronto, ignoring the Romanian physiologist who published first. This raises uncomfortable questions. Should we separate scientific contributions from personal beliefs? Can someone's legitimate research be acknowledged even if their politics were abhorrent? There's no easy answer. The scientific method is supposed to be objective. A correct experimental result is correct regardless of who conducted it or what they believed. But science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Scientists become symbols. Discoveries become narratives. And those narratives carry meaning beyond the laboratory. Celebrating Paulescu as insulin's discoverer would mean elevating an anti-Semite to heroic status, putting his name on stamps and monuments, teaching children to admire him. And after the Holocaust, that became unthinkable. So history chose differently. It chose imperfect scientists with bitter rivalries and messy credit disputes over a scientist whose personal beliefs were monstrous. The Toronto team wasn't perfect, Their collaboration was toxic. Their credit distribution was unfair. But they weren't promoting genocide. That distinction mattered. Still matters. Nicolae Popescu did legitimate scientific work on pancreatic extract. That's historically true. But his name will never be celebrated. Will never be taught to medical students as a hero. Will never be honored with international awards. Because sometimes being technically correct isn't enough. Sometimes your personal beliefs are toxic enough that history decides you don't deserve to be remembered, even if you did get there first. The story of insulin skips over Popescu, not because his science was wrong, but because what he stood for was unacceptable. And maybe that's the right choice. Science can be objective, but the scientists we choose to honor, that's a moral decision. And Nicolae Popescu lost that moral calculus a long time ago. Chapter 5. The Girl They Starved to Save. Let's talk about what diabetes treatment looked like before insulin, because it's worse than you probably imagine. Much worse. Before insulin exists, a child is diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. What happens next? The doctor sits down with the parents and delivers what amounts to a death sentence. Your child will die, probably within a year, maybe within months. But there's something we can try, something that might buy time. It won't save them, nothing can save them, but it might delay the inevitable. We're going to starve your child, not figuratively, literally, medically supervised starvation. This was the Allen treatment, named after Dr. Frederick Allen, who promoted it. The logic was simple, brutal, and technically correct. Diabetic patients can't process carbohydrates properly. Eating carbs raises their blood sugar to toxic levels, accelerating organ damage and pushing them toward diabetic coma. So the solution, such as it was to drastically restrict all carbohydrate intake. Give them so few calories that their blood sugar stays lower. Yes, they'll starve slowly, but they'll starve slower than the diabetes will kill them. Children were put on 500 to 800 calorie diets, sometimes less. For growing, active children who should be eating 2 or 3 times that amount, they wasted away, slowly, visibly, bones showing through skin, eyes sunken, movement weak and listless. Parents had to watch their children starve, had to enforce the diet strictly, because even small amounts of food could push blood sugar dangerously high. It was torture, medically prescribed torture, but it was all they had. And then there was Elizabeth Hughes, daughter of Charles Evans Hughes, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, wealthy, connected, with access to the best medical care available, and dying anyway. In 1919, at age 11, Elizabeth was diagnosed with diabetes. By 1922, she was on the Allen starvation diet, and it was killing her, just slower than the diabetes would have. By the spring of 1922, Elizabeth Hughes weighed approximately 45 pounds. She should have weighed over 100. She was a skeleton, a walking, barely functioning skeleton. Photos from this period are haunting. A teenage girl who looks like a famine victim, skin stretched over bones, no muscle, no fat, just survival at its absolute minimum. She spent her days in bed, too weak to move much, too hungry to think about anything except food. Her mother wrote letters describing how Elizabeth would cry from hunger, how she'd beg for just a little more food, how enforcing the diet felt like abuse. But feeding her more meant death faster, so they starved her. And then, in the summer of 1922, her parents heard about insulin, experimental, unproven, but showing remarkable results in Toronto. They used their wealth and connections. They contacted Banting directly. They begged for access to the experimental treatment. In August 1922, Elizabeth Hughes traveled to Toronto and began insulin therapy under Banting's personal supervision. The results were miraculous, dramatic, almost immediate. With insulin, she could eat. Her body could process food. She gained weight. She gained energy. Color returned to her face. Within weeks, she looked like a different person. Within months, she'd gained 30 pounds of healthy weight. The skeletal girl became a healthy young woman. She went on to live a full life. She married, had children, pursued her interests. She lived into her 70s, dying in 1981 at age 73. But here's the strange part. Despite being one of insulin's earliest and most dramatic success stories, despite being the daughter of a Supreme Court Chief Justice, Elizabeth Hughes kept her diabetes secret for decades. She didn't want to be defined by it, didn't want to be known as the diabetic girl, so she simply didn't tell people. Her role as one of insulin's quiet poster children wasn't publicly known for years. Historians discovered her story much later, piecing together medical records and personal correspondence. But Elizabeth Hughes's story matters because she represents the before and after of insulin more dramatically than almost anyone. Before insulin, a 45-pound skeleton slowly starving under medical supervision. After insulin, a healthy woman living a full, normal life. That transformation, from death sentence to chronic manageable condition, happened because of insulin. But it also reveals the horror of what came before, the desperation that made starvation seem like reasonable treatment, the cruelty of watching children waste away because there was nothing else to offer. The Allen starvation diet wasn't malicious. Doctors genuinely thought they were helping. They were using the only tool available to delay death. But it was still torture, still involved watching children suffer, still required parents to deny food to their starving children. Insulin didn't just treat diabetes, it ended that nightmare. Children could eat, could grow, could live. The starving girl who became insulin's quiet poster child lived 73 years, had children, had grandchildren, experienced a life that would have been impossible 5 years earlier. She was one of the lucky ones. She had wealthy parents who could get her access to experimental treatment. She had connections that got her directly to Banting. Thousands of other children were dying on starvation diets in 1922, unable to access the new miracle drug, dying slowly, painfully, from a disease that was suddenly treatable. But Elizabeth Hughes survived, and in surviving, she demonstrated what insulin could do. Not just extend life, not just delay death, actually restore health, give back a future, turn skeletons back into children. Chapter 6. The Dog Who Became a Hero. Let's talk about Marjorie, a dog, a scrappy, ordinary dog who became one of the most important animals in medical history. Toronto. The Banting and Best experiments are underway. They need diabetic dogs to test their pancreatic extracts. Creating a diabetic dog is brutal but straightforward. Remove the pancreas surgically. This eliminates the body's ability to produce insulin. Blood sugar spikes. The animal develops diabetic symptoms rapidly. Without intervention, a dog without a pancreas dies within days, sometimes a week. The body simply cannot function without insulin. It's fast, it's inevitable, and it provided the perfect experimental model. Banting and Best removed many dogs' pancreases. Most of those dogs died quickly, either from complications of surgery or from diabetes, progressing too rapidly for treatment. But then there was Marjorie. They removed her pancreas. She should have died within a week, but they started injecting her with crude pancreatic extract, and she survived. not for days, for weeks. Eventually, for about 70 days, an astonishing period for a dog without a pancreas. Every day she lived was proof that the extract worked, that it could sustain life, that this wasn't just a temporary effect, but something real, something sustainable. The research team became attached to her. Students would check on her. Staff would visit. Everyone in the lab knew about Marjorie, the dog who kept living when she should have been dead. She wasn't perfectly healthy. The extracts were crude. The injections were painful. She had good days and bad days, but she was alive, walking, eating, interacting, a living, tail-wagging proof of concept. Visitors to the lab were brought to see her. Skeptical scientists who doubted that pancreatic extract could sustain life long-term would observe Marjorie, still alive, weeks after her pancreas was removed. She became a symbol, evidence that this wasn't a fluke, that repeated injections of insulin could actually replace pancreatic function. When Banting and Best presented their results to medical conferences, they could point to Marjorie. 70 days and counting. A dog that should be dead, thriving under experimental treatment. That credibility was crucial. Medical innovations require proof, and Marjorie was walking, breathing, living proof. Eventually, she died. Either the cumulative effects of impure extracts, an infection, or some complication from her surgeries. The records aren't entirely clear. But 70 days. 70 days for an animal that should have lasted less than a week. In those 70 days, Marjorie helped convince the medical establishment that insulin therapy was viable, that it could sustain life long-term, that it was worth pursuing for human use. She's not famous like Laika, the Soviet space dog, or Dolly, the cloned sheep. There are no monuments to Marjorie, no movies about her heroism. But she was a hero, in the quiet, unglamorous way that experimental animals become heroes. She lived when she should have died, and in living, she helped prove that millions of humans could live too. The insulin extracted from animal pancreases, refined and purified, would go on to save countless lives. But before it saved humans, it saved Marjorie. And in saving her, even temporarily, the researchers proved it could be done. Sometimes history turns on the smallest pivots. A dog that lives 70 days instead of 7. That's enough. That's the difference between a failed experiment and a medical revolution. Marjorie didn't know she was changing medicine. She was just a dog getting injections, living day by day, wagging her tail when someone brought food. But those 70 days mattered. Those 70 days helped transform diabetes from an absolute death sentence into a treatable condition. So here's to Marjorie, the scrappy dog who became a pioneer, who lived just long enough to prove the impossible was possible. She deserves to be remembered. Chapter 7. The Man They Tried to Erase. Remember J.J.R. MacLeod from the Nobel Prize controversy? The man Banting accused of stealing credit? Let's talk about who he really was, because the popular narrative did him dirty. John James Rickard MacLeod was born in Scotland in 1876. He trained in medicine and physiology, studied in Germany, taught in London, and eventually became one of the world's leading experts on carbohydrate metabolism. By the time Banting approached him in 1920, MacLeod had spent years studying diabetes, writing about glucose regulation, conducting experiments on how the body processes sugar. He wasn't some bureaucratic nobody. He was the expert, the person who actually understood the underlying physiology. Banting was a surgeon with an idea, a decent idea, but not particularly original. Others had proposed similar approaches to isolating pancreatic secretions. MacLeod listened to Banting's proposal. He was skeptical, which was reasonable. Lots of people had ideas about diabetes. Most led nowhere. But he gave Banting lab space for the summer, assigned Charles Best to help, provided equipment and experimental animals. And then, critically, he went on vacation to Scotland. This was summer 1921. He'd been working all year. He needed a break. And Banting's experiments were low priority, exploratory work that might or might not pan out. So MacLeod left, and in his absence, Banting and Best worked. When MacLeod returned in the fall, he looked at their results, and he immediately recognized both the promise and the problems. The promise. They'd shown that pancreatic extract could lower blood sugar in dogs. That was significant. The problems. The extracts were crude, impure, and toxic. The experiments lacked controls. The data was messy. MacLeod did what any good scientific supervisor would do. He brought in expertise. He recruited James Collip to solve the purification problem. He insisted on better experimental design. He used his professional connections to help get the work published in top journals. He mentored. He guided. He provided resources. He made the work credible. Without MacLeod's involvement, Banting and Best's summer experiments might have remained unpublished curiosities, interesting observations that never went anywhere. MacLeod transformed it into a medical breakthrough, but Banting never forgave him for it. From Banting's perspective, MacLeod had been absent during the hard work and present for the glory. The narrative Banting promoted, and that popular history accepted, was that MacLeod was a credit thief, but the historical evidence tells a different story. MacLeod's lectures and textbooks from before 1920 showed deep understanding of pancreatic function and glucose metabolism. He'd been thinking about these problems for years. His contributions to the Insulin project weren't just administrative. He provided conceptual framework, experimental design, scientific rigor. Yes, he was the department head. Yes, he benefited from his position, but he also earned his position through decades of research and expertise. The popular narrative of insulin discovery, especially in North America, painted MacLeod as a villain, the bureaucrat who tried to steal credit from the brilliant surgeon. But recent historical reevaluations argue that MacLeod was unfairly airbrushed out of the story, or rather, his contributions were minimized while his personality conflicts with Banting were amplified. He shared the Nobel Prize, yes, but his reputation suffered. He was remembered as the guy who didn't deserve it. MacLeod eventually left Toronto and returned to Scotland. The environment had become too toxic. The constant fighting with Banting, the attacks on his character, the public accusations, he simply walked away. He died in Aberdeen in 1935 at the age of 58. And contrary to a popular myth you might hear, he didn't die of diabetes. He died crippled by severe arthritis. He spent his final years in constant physical pain, far removed from the Toronto spotlight. And while his body failed him, he had to watch from across the ocean as his reputation was systematically dismantled by the man he had helped make famous. By the time of his death, the narrative was set. Banting was the hero. Best was the overlooked assistant. Collip was the clever chemist. And MacLeod was the villain who tried to steal credit. That narrative persists today. Ask most people who discovered insulin, and they'll say Banting and Best. Maybe Collip, if they know the detailed history. MacLeod's name comes up as the guy who shared the Nobel Prize controversially, the person who didn't deserve recognition. But that's unfair, demonstrably unfair based on historical evidence. MacLeod provided the scientific foundation, the conceptual understanding, the experimental rigor, the the professional credibility that got insulin taken seriously. Without him, there might have been no Toronto Insulin Project, or it might have failed, or succeeded but remained unpublished and unknown. His contributions were real, essential even. But he made the mistake of being in a position of authority over a resentful subordinate who had a talent for public relations and grudge-holding. Banting controlled the narrative. And in that narrative, MacLeod was the villain. So here's a historical correction. J.R. MacLeod deserved that Nobel Prize. His name belongs on the list of insulin's discoverers, not because he did the hands-on experiments. He didn't, but because scientific discovery isn't just about hands-on work. It's about conceptual understanding, about providing expertise, about making good ideas into great ones, about transforming promising observations into rigorous science. MacLeod did all of that, and he got written out of history anyway. Because sometimes the story matters more than the truth, and the story needed a hero and a villain. MacLeod became the villain, unfairly, unjustly, but irreversibly. His name survives in detailed histories. Scholars of insulin development know his contributions, but the public memory, the simple story, has made him the bad guy. And that's a historical injustice we should probably correct, even if we're a century too late. Chapter 8. When the miracle stopped working. Insulin is a miracle. Leonard Thompson recovered. Elizabeth Hughes is gaining weight. The Toronto team is heroes. And then the miracle starts failing. It's subtle at first. One batch of insulin doesn't work as well. Patients need higher doses. A batch comes back from the manufacturing process with almost no potency. Then it gets worse. Yields collapse. The extraction process that was working consistently suddenly produces nothing usable. Batches are contaminated. Patients who were stable suddenly become unstable. Doctors panic. Diabetic patients who've been brought back from death's door are suddenly in danger again. The insulin they're depending on isn't working. The Toronto team scrambles. They check their methods, review their protocols, try to figure out what changed. But they can't fix it. The production process has become mysteriously unreliable. Here's what they're learning the hard way. Scaling up from laboratory batches to actual pharmaceutical production is incredibly difficult. Making enough insulin for Leonard Thompson, for Elizabeth Hughes, for a handful of patients, that's manageable. Improvised equipment and bathroom chemistry can handle small-scale production. But the demand is enormous. Thousands of diabetic patients across North America need insulin immediately, every day, reliably. The Toronto laboratory setup cannot meet that demand, cannot maintain consistent quality, cannot guarantee supply. The insulin crisis of 1922 to 1923 was existential. The miracle drug existed. Patients knew it existed. Doctors knew it worked. But they couldn't get enough of it. Couldn't trust that the batches they did get would be potent enough. It was a nightmare, giving hope and then threatening to snatch it away because of manufacturing problems. The Toronto team had to make a decision. They were researchers, not pharmaceutical manufacturers. They needed help. They reached out to pharmaceutical companies, specifically Eli Lilly in the United States, and other companies with experience in biological product manufacturing. These companies had something the university didn't: industrial-scale fermentation expertise, quality control systems, sterile manufacturing facilities, distribution networks. Lilly's chemists looked at the Toronto process and immediately saw the problems. The methods were inconsistent. The equipment was inadequate. The quality control was virtually non-existent. They set about industrializing the process, standardizing every step, developing better extraction techniques, creating quality control assays to ensure consistent potency. They borrowed techniques from brewing, from other biological manufacturing processes. They built dedicated facilities. They trained staff. Within months, insulin production went from an artisanal laboratory process to an industrial pharmaceutical operation. Yields improved. Quality became consistent. Supply became reliable. Insulin went from a miracle that might or might not work depending on the batch to a standardized pharmaceutical product. But this transformation had consequences, big ones. Insulin went from an academic discovery, something for the world, as Banting liked to say, to a pharmaceutical product controlled by corporations. The Toronto team had sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1, symbolically, with the stated intention that insulin would be widely available, not monopolized for profit. But someone had to manufacture it. Someone had to invest in facilities, equipment, quality control. Someone had to take the financial risk. And those someones were pharmaceutical companies who expected to profit from their investment. The near disaster of 1922, when insulin production almost collapsed, pushed the discovery out of academic hands and into corporate control. By 1923, Eli Lilly and other companies were producing the vast majority of the world's insulin. They held licensing agreements. They had manufacturing expertise that universities couldn't match. The $1 patent became the foundation of a pharmaceutical industry worth billions. Was this inevitable? Maybe. Probably. Universities don't manufacture drugs at scale. They discover. They innovate. But they don't run factories, manage supply chains, handle global distribution. That requires industrial capacity, which requires corporate investment, which requires profit incentive. The production crisis of 1922 made that clear. Academic idealism couldn't keep insulin production running. Industrial expertise could. But it marks a turning point, the moment when a medical discovery for the world became a commercial product. The implications of that transformation are still playing out a century later, which we'll get to in the final chapter. For now, understand this. Insulin almost failed, not because the science was wrong, but because making it reliably at scale was incredibly difficult. The Toronto team solved the scientific problem, but they couldn't solve the manufacturing problem. Pharmaceutical companies did. And in solving it, they gained control. The miracle that nearly died was saved by industrialization, and that industrialization changed everything. Chapter 9. The Painful Truth. Let's talk about what those early insulin injections were actually like, because the sanitized version glosses over how brutal they were. Leonard Thompson got the first injection. We've talked about the abscesses, the failed result. But let's be specific about what that injection was. It was 7.5 milliliters of a murky, brownish liquid injected into his buttock muscle. That's a lot of fluid to inject in one place. For context, modern insulin injections are often less than 1 milliliter injected subcutaneously, just under the skin. But in 1922, they were injecting much larger volumes, directly into muscle, using thick needles. The insulin itself wasn't the clear, pH-balanced pharmaceutical product you see today. It was a crude suspension, light brown, slightly cloudy, sometimes with visible sediment if you looked closely. Why brown? Because it was still contaminated with breakdown products from pancreatic tissue, blood proteins, cellular debris. Despite Collap's purification, it was still far from pure. And when you inject that into muscle tissue, the body reacts. Inflammation, swelling, pain. sometimes infection at the injection site. Early patients described the injections as excruciating, a burning sensation that spread from the injection site through the surrounding muscle. Some said it felt like the liquid was eating through tissue. The injection sites would turn red, hot, swollen. Abscesses formed in many patients, pockets of infection that had to be drained or that burst on their own. Some patients developed so much scar tissue at common injection sites that the insulin couldn't be absorbed properly. Their thighs and buttocks became maps of scar tissue, hardened areas where repeated injections had damaged tissue. And dosing? Dosing was more art than science. There were no standardized units. Different batches had different potencies. Doctors had to adjust doses based on the patient's response, their blood sugar levels, their symptoms. Too little insulin, and blood sugar stayed dangerously high. Too much, and blood sugar crashed, causing hypoglycemia, which could lead to confusion, seizures, coma, death. Finding the right dose meant trial and error on living patients, some of whom had severe reactions. Patients had to learn to recognize the signs of low blood sugar and quickly eat something sugary. They carried sugar lumps or candy everywhere, just in case. But despite all of this, despite the pain and abscesses and uncertainty and trial and error, patients lined up for treatment. Because the alternative was death, certain, inevitable, relatively quick death from diabetic ketoacidosis. Compared to that, painful injections, scarred tissue, and the constant fear of dosing errors were acceptable. Parents brought their dying children and held them down while doctors injected brown liquid into their muscles. The children screamed, the parents cried, but they came back the next day for another injection. Because their children were alive, gaining weight, getting stronger. The insulin was working. Even if it hurt, even if it was dangerous, even if it was crude and impure and sometimes caused infections, it was turning death sentences into chronic, manageable conditions. By the mid-1920s, manufacturing improved. Insulin became clearer, purer, less contaminated. Standardized units were developed. Injection techniques improved. By the 1930s, different forms of insulin were available, some acting quickly, others more slowly, allowing better blood sugar control. By the 1980s, synthetic human insulin produced through recombinant DNA technology replaced animal insulin, reducing allergic reactions and improving consistency. Today, insulin injections are relatively painless. Tiny needles, subcutaneous injection, clear liquid, precise dosing. Modern diabetics have a completely different experience than those early patients. But for the first years, insulin therapy was brutal. It saved lives, but at a cost. Physical pain, constant injections, abscesses and scar tissue, fear of dosing errors, trial and error, with a drug that could kill if you got it wrong. Elizabeth Hughes, the starving girl who recovered, took insulin injections daily for the rest of her life. Decades of injections. Her body carried the scars, but she lived 73 years instead of dying at 14. That trade-off, pain and inconvenience for life, was worth it. Unquestionably worth it. But we shouldn't pretend it was easy or comfortable, or that those early patients weren't suffering even as they were being saved. The crude, painful early insulin was still a miracle, just a miracle that hurt. Chapter 10. A miracle they still can't afford. Now we need to talk about something that should make you angry, because a century after insulin's discovery, after all the triumphant narratives and medical miracles, people are still dying from lack of access. Let me be clear. Insulin is one of the most important medical discoveries in human history. It transforms type 1 diabetes from a death sentence into a chronic, manageable condition. It's been around for over 100 years. The basic science is well understood. The manufacturing process is established. There are multiple companies producing it. And yet, in 2024, people are dying because they can't afford insulin. In the United States, one of the wealthiest countries on earth, diabetic patients ration insulin. They skip doses. They take less than prescribed because the cost is prohibitive. Stories appear regularly of diabetics dying because they tried to stretch their insulin supply. Young adults who aged out of their parents' insurance and suddenly faced $1,000 monthly costs. People who had to choose between insulin and rent. And it's worse in low and middle-income countries. Analysis from the WHO and UN agencies show that many people with diabetes, perhaps millions globally, cannot reliably access or afford insulin. In some countries, a month's supply of insulin costs a significant fraction of average monthly salary. It's simply unaffordable for ordinary people. So they ration, they skip doses, they die slowly from complications that could have been prevented. Remember the history we just talked about. Banting sold the insulin patent for $1. $1. Symbolically, his stated reason: insulin should be available to everyone who needs it. It should belong to the world, not be monopolized for profit. The Toronto team wanted insulin to be accessible, affordable, a public good, not a luxury commodity. And yet, a century later, insulin is expensive, sometimes prohibitively expensive. A life-saving drug that some people simply cannot afford. How did this happen? Part of it is the complexity of pharmaceutical manufacturing. Modern insulin is sophisticated, often genetically engineered, produced using recombinant DNA technology that requires expensive facilities, expertise, quality control. But that doesn't fully explain prices that have increased dramatically over the past decades, far outpacing inflation or manufacturing costs. The truth is simpler and uglier. Insulin is expensive because pharmaceutical companies can charge high prices and patients have no choice but to pay. Diabetics need insulin to live. It's not optional. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's a biological necessity that gives manufacturers enormous pricing power. Patients cannot simply stop buying. They die if they do. In economic terms, demand is perfectly inelastic, which means prices can be set based on what the market will bear, not on manufacturing costs or reasonable profit margins. And so insulin has become expensive. In some markets, extraordinarily expensive. There have been some improvements. Generic insulin is now available in some countries. Price caps have been implemented in some jurisdictions. But globally, access remains a problem, a serious, life-threatening problem. The bitter irony is that insulin is simultaneously one of medicine's greatest successes and one of its most visible failures. The science succeeded. The drug works. The manufacturing is established. The distribution networks exist. But the economic and political systems have failed to ensure access. Frederick Banting wanted insulin to belong to the world, but the world has turned it into a commodity, subject to market forces, pricing decisions, profit calculations. And that means people die, not from lack of scientific knowledge, not from lack of manufacturing capability, not from insufficient supply globally. They die from lack of access, from inability to pay, from systems that prioritize profit over lives. This is not a comfortable ending to the insulin story. It's not triumphant or celebratory, but it's true. And it's a reminder that scientific breakthroughs, even the most important ones, are not enough. you can discover the most amazing medicine in the world. You can solve impossible problems. You can transform diseases from death sentences into manageable conditions. But if people can't access it, if they can't afford it, if the systems distributing it fail them, then the miracle is incomplete. Insulin saved millions of lives. It should save millions more, but only if we ensure people can actually get it. The science was solved a century ago. We're still working on the access part, and until we solve that, until every diabetic who needs insulin can reliably afford and access it, the story isn't finished. The miracle is real, but it's still out of reach for too many people. And that should bother you, should make you angry, because it's solvable. It's not a scientific problem. It's a political and economic problem. And those are problems we choose not to solve. Closing. So there you have it, the real story of insulin. 10 chapters that take you from a failed first injection to bathroom chemistry, from Nobel Prize fights to erased scientists, from starving children to heroic dogs, from production crises to painful injections, and finally to the uncomfortable truth that a miracle discovered for the world has become too expensive for many people to access. Insulin's history is messy. It's political. It's filled with conflict, controversy, and uncomfortable questions about credit, access, and justice. But it's also a story of desperate innovation, of scientists working in crude conditions to solve impossible problems, of parents watching their children waste away and grasping at experimental treatments, of a dog who lived 70 days and helped prove that life could be sustained. It's a story of collaboration, even when that collaboration was toxic and bitter, of multiple people contributing different expertise, of discoveries that required biochemists and physicians and department heads and pharmaceutical companies all working toward the same goal, even when they hated each other. And it's a reminder that scientific progress isn't clean. It doesn't happen through individual genius having eureka moments. It happens through trial and error, failure and persistence, conflict and compromise. Leonard Thompson survived a failed first injection to receive a better one. Elizabeth Hughes went from a 45-pound skeleton to a healthy woman who lived 73 years. Marjorie the dog proved it could be done. But that success came with costs, painful injections, scarred bodies, credit disputes that lasted decades, scientists whose contributions were minimized or erased entirely, and a century later, the cost is still being paid by diabetics who ration insulin, by people in low-income countries who simply cannot access it, by families watching loved ones die from a disease that should be treatable. Insulin is one of medicine's greatest triumphs, and one of its ongoing failures. The discovery succeeded. The distribution continues to fail. Next time you hear about insulin, about Banting and Best, and the miracle cure for diabetes, remember the full story. The failures that preceded success, the scientists who were written out, the patients who suffered even as they were saved, the dog who became a hero, the production crisis that pushed it into corporate control. And remember that access matters as much as discovery, that solving the scientific problem is only the first step, that getting miracles to the people who need them is just as important as creating them. Thanks for watching this journey through insulin's complicated history. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit that like button. Subscribe for more content that pulls back the curtain on medical history. And let me know in the comments what topic you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical,